Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.
Introduction and commentary by Dr. John Henrik Clarke. It's called Marcus Garvey and the Vision of Africa. And very succinctly on the back, there's this paragraph that, better than anything else I've read, kind of summarizes Marcus Garvey's achievements. So I want to read it to you so that you can take it with you henceforth. Among black leaders, Marcus Garvey, 1887 to 1940, was unique. His popularity was universal. His program for the return of African people to their motherland shook the foundations of 3 empires. All subsequent black power movements have owed a debt to his example, and his prophecy has been fulfilled in the independence that brought into being more than 30 African nations. I advise you and urge you to, when you have the opportunity, to pick up this book. Okay? This time we'll bring forth Dr. John Henrik Clarke. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We cannot talk about Marcus Garvey without talking about the whole of the African world and how the African world relates to the rest of the world. One of the things we have lost most dear to us, that has done the greatest damage to us, we have lost the feeling of ourselves as being a people so important. We stand at the center of the world, and all the world revolves around us. It is hard for us to think of ourselves in that way, but that's the way it is. That silly war in Western Asia, mistakenly called the Middle East, is indirectly about us, because if it wasn't for certain things that had happened to us, the condition of those nations would be different. They rose up first. They got their first nationhood, their first shaping in world history through the slave trade that rose after the rise of Islam, and they used Islam as the handmaiden for the trade, as the Europeans used Christianity as the handmaiden for their slave trade that lasted 500 years, and that's not over to this day. You have failed to make a connection between yourself and everything that's happening in the world. We have some misconceptions about Marcus Garvey. We have some misconceptions brought into being because certain people want to wash their ego. There are people who said that Marcus Garvey came to America and found black America with a wishbone and gave them a backbone, which is a lie. What you have to do in order to understand Marcus Garvey and his significance is to look at the Caribbean islands 100 years before he was born and look at black America 100 years before he was born. I will begin by discussing the antecedents of Marcus Garvey. Let's look at the antecedents of Marcus Garvey in the Caribbean islands with major emphasis on Jamaica. Then you can see how it was logical for a Marcus Garvey to emerge. In an island where color consciousness was a prevailing thing, how did this jet black man emerge with no color consciousness toward himself and with no apology for his being? Because he looked back at the revolutionary heritage of the island that gave him birth and the revolutionary heritage of the Caribbean islands itself that had the most successful slave revolts of any African people outside of Africa. Successful because they maintained an African culture continuity until they suddenly decided in the middle of the 19th century that they would become black English and black Dutch and black French and black every damn thing except African. But until that point, there were people using their African culture continuity in revolts and holding themselves together based on this culture continuity. Now, let's look at the roots of this culture continuity and the roots of the emergence of a Marcus Garvey and why his emergence in the Caribbean islands is absolutely logical. Then we have to think at the end of it, because if Marcus Garvey was walking down the streets of Jamaica right now with the same idea, with the same program, some disranged Jamaican would stone him to death. It is so un-Garvey at this point. It is so far from Garvey. Now, they kill him because they have bargained their African culture continuity and their African self to be those things most unlike themselves. Now, Marcus Garvey, born 1887. Now let's look at what was happening 1787 in those islands. The Maroon revolts were already in motion and had not only flourished in Jamaica, it had flourished throughout the Caribbean islands. The so-called Bush Negro revolts had already occurred in Suriname. The Baptiste revolt in Guyana had already occurred. The Haitian Maroons were already on the march, and the Haitian Maroons were on the march the same time as the Jamaican Maroons, although the Jamaican Maroons are the best known. There were Maroons throughout the hemisphere, including the United States. Now, in this period of resistance to slavery, something was happening on this island. 1830 and thereabouts, the British went through the motion of emancipating their slaves. It was a motion only. Now, while the slave was emancipated, he had to go back and work on the same plantation where he had been a slave because no other employment was open to him. Now he must take care of his wife, his children, his housing, his clothing for a pittance. So the new freedom was less secure than the old slavery. By 1865, the Jamaicans began to discover that the emancipation was a fake. This is why it is nonsense when a Caribbean person says, our freedom came 30 years before your emancipation. All you're saying is that your fakery came 30 years before our fakery, inasmuch as neither one of us are emancipated to this day, because emancipation is nothing that someone can do for you. It is something either you do for yourself or it is not real. Freedom is something you take with your own hands. You secure it with your own hands. No generation leaves it for another generation. Each generation in its own way, even if it inherits freedom, must secure that freedom all over again with its own strength, its own will, its own hands. And when you forget that and become lax, you have freedom no more. All right, 1850 in the Caribbean islands, the British, the Jamaican colors approached the British. They wanted special privileges. And they were telling the British, if you give us the special privileges, we will protect you from the blacks. And when the British were reluctant to give them special privileges, by 1865, they said, give us these privileges or we're going to join the blacks. Now this accounts for the large number of mulattoes involved in the Moret Bay uprising 1865, and Gordon and other mulattoes who committed themselves to that revolution. Once the British understood this, they gradually began to give these privileges. They began to create a multi-ethnic society based on color, to the point where Jamaica became the most stratified society along color, caste, and economic lines in all the world. Almost as stratified as India with its multiplicity of castes. 70 different definitions of color and caste in Jamaica alone. Special jobs for different people of special gradations of color and hair texture. And this would destabilize the country to the point where the British had an internal army protecting them, and this robbed Jamaica of the privilege that went to Haiti. The Haitian revolts were set in motion by Jamaicans. Jamaicans, troublemakers, that they wanted to get rid of, so they sold them to plantations in Haiti. The Jamaican farmers sold them to plantations in Haiti, and the most noted being Volkman, who decided he's going to be a priest. That he's a priest, and he wasn't going to work on the farm. So as a priest, he began to organize the Yoruba slaves and the solidification of the Haitian Revolution to the point, and he moved it so fast, Toussaint Louverture had to run to catch up with the revolution in order to lead it. And yet, there are two Jamaicans left out of history that helped to set this revolution in motion, Macandel and Volkman. I'm saying that Jamaica forgot its revolutionary heritage. And once a people forget their revolutionary heritage, they come like beggars with an empty cup at the door of a people less than they are, only they don't know that the people are less than they are. They follow people who don't know where they are going just because the people are the color of power. Because Marcus Garvey is descendant of the revolutionary black Jamaican Maroons who fought, he did not grow up with all the color caste stipulation and all the color caste privileges and fear of other Jamaicans. Now you can see the mentality of Marcus Garvey emerging. You can see now where he get all the nerve and the bombast, because he grew up with confidence in himself. And besides, he was a master craftsman. And being a master craftsman, mastering a trade that is needed, almost indispensable to the island, this gave him confidence and a little privilege. He was a master printer. He would print He would call strikes, he would ask for better condition, and he would go down throughout Central America, asking for better conditions, but studying the people. Now you can see the antecedents of Marcus Garvey before he would arrive in the United States. He would go to England, he would work, he would study, he would work on Duz Muhammad Ali's newspaper, the African Times, an Orient Review. He would read an editorial in that newspaper. The editorial was quote from of all things, a white black nationalist named Booth. Booth was a man in Nyasaland, now the country called Malawi. He had grown sick of other white missionaries, and he went through this country telling the Africans the white man cannot be trusted. And he was saying Africa for the Africans. When finally the Africans said that you're a white man, can you be trusted? To his everlasting credit, he said no. Marcus Garvey would read in Duz Muhammad Ali's paper the quote from Booth, said Africa for the Africans. And Marcus Garvey would add, those at home and those abroad. One thing about Marcus Garvey, he never stole from a second-rater. And he always rehashed what he took from others in such a way it became his, add his own original stamp to it. Coming back to Jamaica, he was a failure again in the Jamaica of that day, as much failure he would be in the Jamaica of this day, because the revolutionary atmosphere that could protect Marcus Garvey does not exist in Jamaica. It does not exist any place in the Caribbean island for this day. Okay, now let's come to the United States and let's look at his antecedents in the United States. My main point here is that Marcus Garvey did not announce anything new, but brought it in such a way and put it in a language that masses of people could understand. You could whistle it, you could feel it, and that his timing was so good. Now, 1787 in the United States, there had emerged in New England a small black elite. Frederick Douglass, Prince Hall, who started the Masons and called it the African Lodge. Blacks had fought in the American Revolution, began to demand a little privileges based on that. Blacks had grown tired of going into white churches and sitting on the side or up in the buzzards roof, and they had challenged whites, and after the challenge they found the independent black church, the African, the Methodist Episcopal Church. They didn't toy with this word Negro or colored. They didn't water it down with black. Black tells you how you look, but it don't tell you who you are. And they didn't deal with this word fro. There is no fro in Africa. When an Italian, you ask an Italian what he said, I'm Italian American. He didn't say I'm a fro. Spell it out, Italian American. So get it out of your mouth, means say it straight, African. Get the word Africa all the way in there. And don't break Africa with the word fro. Leave out the fro. I'm saying that at this point, In our history, we were not only longing for Africa, we were having thoughts about return 100 years before Marcus Garvey was born. In the African Lodge, in the early African societies, the first Masonic order found by a man from Barbados, Prince Hall, the Odd Fellows, found by a man from Antigua, Peter Ogden. Now look what you got then that you don't have now. Caribbean people and African American people working hand and side by side. No one is calling each other any names. But they realized something then you don't realize now. That the slave ship brought no West Indians, brought no black Americans, brought no Jamaicans. And because they were all African people, they had a common interest as African people. Now, first Masonic order found by a Caribbean person, Prince Hall. Another lodge found by another one, Peter Ogden. And when they began the early Back to Africa movement, when Martin Delany went out to search for a place for settlement, he went out with a Jamaican, Robert Campbell, who wrote a classical account of the trip, Pilgrimage to My Motherland, included in a book called Search for a Place. Delany was a Harvard man, and he issued a Harvard man's report. His English was superb. All the I's were dotted, all the T's were crossed. But if you ever get the book, make a comparison. Read Campbell's book. His language is rough-hued, and sometimes his sentence structure is off. But the man's love for Africa, for returning to Africa, his response to Africa, is pure poetry, pure commitment. Now, we're working together now, instead of calling names, making division. Our first newspaper, Freedom's Journal, is edited by another Jamaican, a Jamaican mulatto, John B. Ruswan. After he finished the editing of Freedom's Journal, he went out to Liberia and edited the Liberian Herald, a paper that's still in existence. And he was governor of one of the provinces. He didn't say, I'm a West Indian governor, I'm a Jamaican governor. He said, I'm a governor. You have to understand that this early manifestations of Pan-Africanism before it had its name, and that all of this was preparation for the ultimate emergence of a Marcus Garvey. David Walker's appeal, Nat Turner revolt, Gabriel Prosser revolt, Denmark Vesey's revolt, especially David Walker's appeal to the colored people of the world to take up arms against your enemy. All Marcus Garvey was at it, let's leave this place. Coming near the end of that century, a Back to Africa minister, again, a mulatto who thought that by virtue of being close to whites, he deserved some privileges. And when he discovered that his tail can be kicked just as hard as the black is black, he began to fight like the black is black. Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. He would mount an American flag in his pulpit before his sermon. Then he would point to the flag and say, this flag ain't nothing but a GD rag. And he would preach a whole sermon against what this country had done to his people before he started his regular sermon. He started a Back to Africa movement around the same time Marcus Garvey was born. And as we came into the 20th century, We were arguing over the Booker T. Washington concept, the Du Bois concept. Africans had been revolting all over Africa. The Caribbean islands are now fighting for some form of constitutional government. England had created a model colony in Barbados. This is why they still think of themselves as Little England. All of this had happened now. Marcus Garvey would begin to emerge into consciousness around 1908. After his Central American trip, he would go to England where he would meet Duz Muhammad Ali. Now, when he returned to Jamaica and tried to find the Universal Negro Improvement Association and failed in Jamaica, he came to the United States with the hope of getting the kind of money he needed to establish a school like Tuskegee. Booker T. Washington had issued him an invitation in 1914, but when he arrived in 1916, Booker T. Washington was dead, and he couldn't get along with the people Booker T. Washington left behind. He toured the United States, speaking and impressing a whole lot of people with his nerve. Now here you have to deal with something which you fail to deal with. When you grow up in a country where you are the majority, you have a different outlook on the world, though you are a slave. Marcus Garvey had a different outlook on the world. When you grow up in a country where you are the minority, where you have to do what most black Americans still have to do, you rise each morning and petition a white person for the right to live to the end of the day. And you can say I'm wrong, but think it over. Who do you have to get a job from? And even if you own your business, who do you have to get your products from? If you're selling vegetables, who's your wholesaler? We still rise each morning, one way or the other, petition one white person or the other for the right to live to the end of the day. Marcus Garvey came to America at a time after the First World War. Blacks were returning, being put upon riots. East St. Louis, blacks just go to a gate and ask for jobs and were driven away. They made bonfires and burned black children. And in Chicago, the riots were widespread. Marcus Garvey would go to Chicago and rally the blacks. They didn't need much rallying because they had freshly arrived from the South looking for jobs in Pagan House, looking for jobs in Chicago. And they'd taken so much abuse in the South that up north they said they wasn't going to take it. Many of them began to grease wire and put it across the street. And so when the thugs came in, that car hit the wire that stopped the car, then the black thug would jump out and teach them a lesson. That stopped the riots. Marcus Garvey had told them, look what you see, they don't want us here. Not only let's go home to Africa, let's go home in our own ships. Now the dreamer began to dream the great dream. It was after the First World War. The Secretary of War, Newton D. Baker, had told black Americans that your lot will not be changed by virtue of participating in this war. And to prove that his point, some blacks were lynched in their uniforms. We give you nothing. Blacks were not permitted in combat in the American army. Jim Pershing didn't want them near the battlefield. The French said that I will take all you got. And the blacks who distinguished themselves in battle distinguished themselves under French commanders. The Red Cross, going to the field to pick up the wounded and the dead, left the blacks to die. Du Bois had written an editorial called Close Ranks. Let's forget our differences and let this war be won. And when he went to France and saw the condition, he wanted to take it all back. Close ranks for what? Now, in this atmosphere, 1917, in the red summer of 1919, riots all over the country, burning blacks down. Now can you see why it was easy for Marcus Garvey to create the atmosphere and to add to the atmosphere of return, because the country had rejected us, and he was telling us there is a land that is yours. He said the American promise wasn't made to you. The American dream wasn't dreamed for you. I will make you a new promise. I will give you a new dream, and I will give you a new land. That's Africa. 1920, he was to call the largest convention of blacks ever. Old Madison Square Garden, turning back 30,000 people a day, and only 30,000 could fit into the auditorium. Marcus Garvey was doing more than just giving out speeches. This man, with his multifaceted of talent, presented a platform for singers, dancers, musicians. He was creating the semblance of a state. And what we have lost in the world is the idea that we once ruled a state, all of that. During the same time, he would petition Liberia, that sick nation that rejected him and would have been a better nation had they not rejected him. He petitioned them for settlement. 1920. They did not tell him then that they wasn't going to permit him, because these stooges of America, who hadn't changed to this day, lied to Marcus Garvey. And someone think that because Du Bois had a fake position, plenipotentiary, that Du Bois had some power. Du Bois had no power. I think we need to be honest with ourselves. I think we charged Du Bois with a whole lot that he's guilty of. He said some unfortunate things about Marcus Garvey and later lived to take it back, took it back on several occasions. And he did something most of you haven't done. You haven't admitted when you were wrong. Now, in 1923, Marcus Garvey is in difficulty with the steamship lines. The different trials, this would go on. Marcus Garvey would commit some serious errors. He would dismiss his lawyer and be his own lawyer, and he would lose his own case. There's much more to it than that. In this book, there's a chapter called Trials and Triumphs of Marcus Garvey. But the complete trial is available in some places. You can get the complete trial. Marcus Garvey was not guilty as charged. This is why I'm against the idea of pardoning Marcus Garvey. To pardon him indicate that he was guilty, and you're asking people to forgive the guilt. I'm for the vindication of Marcus Garvey because he wasn't guilty in the first place. I'm for asking this nation to apologize for having imprisoned him. But in 1927, he was freed from Atlanta prison. While he was away, The organization did not fall apart, but it became shattered into several factions, because we are people with bruised ego, and we suffer terribly from ego starvation. We haven't envisioned an army full of generals with no privates, because everybody want to be Mr. Somebody and Mrs. Somebody. We argue among ourselves, split up, and now we got 10 heads instead of one, and neither one of them achieving anything. We are the most organized, we are the most meetingest people in America. We have more leaders and less leadership than any people in this country. With no centralized leadership responsible for the whole people. What would happen after the deportation of Marcus Garvey? The movement would go on in some fashion. T. Thomas Fortune, one of the great journalists we have, would still continue to work for the old Negro world, to write for it. We could continue to be its editor. It would still attract some of the most able African-American minds of that day. Farris, one of the finest intellects to come out of the Garvey movement, was now in the process of his book, The Africans Abroad, still worth reading after all these years. In the shadow of the Garvey movement, a whole literature emerged. Tony Martin, Wellesley College, who did the book Race First, have done some smaller books dealing with different aspects of Garveyism, Garvey and Pan-Africanism, literary Garveyism, Garvey as a hero. All these books need to be read. We as a people overhear conversations, and sometimes with a cocktail in our hand, and we become authorities on what we heard, but we didn't read the book. Why don't you shock me by reading a whole book, every page of it, then quote correctly when you're quoting? Marcus Garvey in Jamaica would run for public office. He would win once. Second time around, the mulatto group that he had attacked so scathingly was waiting for him the second time. And he would lose on a technicality. He would find himself in debt, and he would go back to his trade as a master printer. He would pay off his debts. And then he would prepare to go to England. As he boarded the ship going to England, all the reporters gathered around to hear the last words of Marcus Garvey before he departed. He says, all right, come on, let me, I've got something to say. Yes. Listen. And in the silence, with that pen all to this great message, Marcus Garvey said, Jamaica is a ridiculous country. Bye. A contradiction to end all contradictions. Marcus Garvey knew something that Jamaicans still don't seem to know. They could have been one of the great island nations of the world. They got so involved with color, caste, and class, they did not become. They got so involved in being those things most unlike themselves. They could not become what they needed to become and to develop that great potential. It may not be too late. Then again, it may be too late. They have the manpower, they have the educational power, they have the brain power, they have the trained personnel. They've got a good, strong working class. They've got a country with a good basic climate, a lot of greenery everywhere. It generally rains at night, and so when you wake up in the morning, things are green. With a little manipulation, it can grow most of the thing it needs to eat, the things it needs to eat. It don't have to import Kellogg's cornflakes. They can make cornflakes out of Jamaican corn. If you use your imagination. Jamaica once made a good grade of furniture. It's now collector's items if you can ever get to buy a piece. Good Jamaican mahogany existed then. They cut it so fast until now they have to wait 20 years before it's mature enough to cut again. Jamaican mahogany used to have 7 different grains, 7 different colors of mahogany. A light mahogany, a dark mahogany, a brownish mahogany. Can you think of making a piece of furniture with all that beautiful design on it? I went to a school in Jamaica where the schoolmaster showed me a bed, and he said my grandfather was born on this bed. I was born on the bed. My mother was born on the bed. The bed was so strong you could put a truck on top of the bed and wouldn't even dent it. Good old mahogany. You don't see that kind of wood anymore, and you don't see that kind of craftsmanship anymore because people don't take that amount of time anymore. Now let me conclude something that has no conclusion, because Marcus Garvey is part of a continuum. He would set in motion the thought pattern that would bring African independent nations into being. He would so influence people in Africa until in Swaziland, an old king thought that his people were about to return, began to plant extra crops to feed them when they got there. The concept of Garveyism was that strong. His newspapers were given to different sailors and dropped off at different ports in other parts of the world. Cuba had 27 branches of the Garvey movement. In Cuba, there were 16 branches in South Africa. I've gone through a lot of the Garvey records. I advise you that you should read Robert Hill's documents of the Garvey papers. The 6th volume is already out. I have up to 5 right now. The documentation is just absolutely magnificent. One of the great jobs of research done in our times by a black scholar. Now, Robert Hill's notes and Robert Hill's introductions, scholarly done, but some of his conclusions open to question. But I tell you that one thing you need not doubt: the documents are documents. He couldn't change the documents. And when a definitive history of Marcus Garvey is written, and it may not be done in our times, we will have to rely very heavily on the documents that Professor Hill has brought to our attention. This is the greatest collection of documents on Marcus Garvey that has ever been developed and edited. His influence would be so widespread that he would be the major influence in the 5th Pan-African Congress, one of the most important, in Manchester, England, 1945, with Nkrumah, George Padmore, Peter Abrahams, Johnstone Kenyatte, who later became Jomo Kenyatte, people who would later become heads of state in Africa, influenced by the teachings of Marcus Garvey, and who would incorporate the teachings of Marcus Garvey into the structure of that nation. Nkrumah would have a Black Star Square, Black Star Line, And Marcus Garvey's influence in Nkrumah was profound. Marcus Garvey's influence on the rest of Africa was equally profound. And had these states not been waylaid imitating the parliamentary procedure of the West that's never going to work in Africa, they could have brought great African territorial states into being as against these imitation European nation states that now exist in Africa, too restrictive for the African character, too restrictive for African culture. The European created the nation state with its tight borders and its selfishness. The African had the territorial state, where a multiplicity of cultures existed within one border with respect for all. And they did not begin a conflict one to the other until the European came and created that conflict. So-called tribal wars did not start in Africa until the coming of the Europeans, when he would put one against the other in order to conquer both. Every person that came into Africa did Africa a disservice. Earlier today, I was accused of Arab bashing in an interview over WNYC. I was saying that the Arab slave trade started 1,000 years before the European slave trade, and that it drained Africa of so much time and energy and organization. The African did not have the organization and the energy to successfully resist the European slave trade. What Marcus Garvey was saying to us, in essence, is that I will make you a whole people again. I will heal the wounds of this 500 years of oppression. He would ask the question, where are your men of affairs? Where are your captains of industry? Having not found them, he began to try to make them. In restoring our confidence in ourselves, the confidence to rule whole nations, he would tell us, up, up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will. Now let's apply that to today, because you have a lot of fake independent states in Africa. How can a nation in Africa be independent when it is so dependent on the European? It does not even produce the safety pin to hold its child's diaper together. Don't even produce the toilet paper for his bathroom. Don't even produce his underwear. No nation of people so unproductive, so unimaginative that they don't even produce their underwear cannot call themselves free. We have to study the Liberia scheme. We must study the over $50,000 in equipment he had placed in Liberia before they told him in 1924 they wasn't going to let him settle. Steam shovels, people who could run brickyards, builders, architects, all the means of a nation. And had he been permitted to settle in Liberia and cure the wounds of that sick nation, the African independence explosion would have occurred a generation before and would have been successful. This dreamer from Jamaica, who is still not understood in Jamaica or in the African world in total, need to be looked at again in context with our future. We might have to step back in order to move forward. We might have to resign ourselves to eating the food we produce, wearing the clothes that we make, we might understand that a nation means self-reliance. We might take an inventory and find out what goes into the making of a nation. And we might start at the top and fulfill all those needs. If you're going to make a locomotive, sometime you might start by making a safety pin. And remember, other people in the world started with less. 200 years ago, the Japanese did not even have a good wheelbarrow. Look at them now. Someone challenged them. Someone challenged them to come out of the lethargy of their culture and meet the challenge of a changing world. The intelligence of a people can be measured by to what extent they adjust and understand the nature of change. We as a people going to have to prove ourselves equal to the nature of change. And to prove yourself equal to the nature of change, you have to prove yourself equal to the nature of revolution. And realize revolution is not always killing people. Revolution is making a dramatic change in your own life and the life around you. Doing for yourself what you've been expecting other people to do for you. You cannot start by hoping to have a great mass around you. You can take the teachings of Marcus Garvey, especially his African fundamentals. You can look at the documents compiled by Professor Hill. You can look at the work compiled by Professor Martin, Tony Martin, and other scholars who found different approaches to Marcus Garvey. You can make up your mind that you're going to have to stop being those small, selfish people worrying about petty sororities and fraternities and a whole lot of things, wasting your time. You're going to have to learn that everything that touches your life must contribute to your liberation or be thrown into the ash can of history. If you're going to start a revolution, I advise that you start with a mirror. You stand before that mirror and like what you see, and say to the person staring at you, you and I are going to change the world. We're not going to wait for a mob to join us. We're not going to wait for tomorrow, because we're going to start right now. Thank you.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.